Welcome. This is Bite Size, a series where I take a short look at a short game. I don't have much time, so let's get going. Rayman for the Game Boy Color was an obscure game, but its sequel, Rayman 2 for the GBC, is downright enigmatic. It dropped at such a weird time, December of 2001. That's after late GBC games like Pokemon Crystal and the Oracle Zelda games. Heck, the Game Boy Advance was already out with releases like Golden Sun, the then Japanese exclusive Ace Attorney, and Wario Land 4. I wonder how fast I can beat that game. Even Rayman Advance, a true handheld port of the first game, had released earlier that year. I mean, there were people in Japan playing Luigi's Mansion, SA2 Battle, and Smash Bros. Melee on their GameCubes when Rayman 2 came out on the Game Boy Color. It honestly feels like an afterthought, like the team behind the first GBC entry handed their engine, assets, and music off to an entirely different team and said, "Good luck." That doesn't make it a bad game, just one that's incredibly easy to overlook. Actually, like its predecessor, Rayman 2 for the GBC, let's just agree to call it Rayman 2, is a solid, if simple, 8-bit 2D platformer. It's not quite as colorful as its predecessor since it adheres to the art direction of the console version of Rayman 2, which we'll just call The Great Escape. I'd probably recommend the first installment over this one, but if you've already beaten that and like what you played, I can't see a reason why you shouldn't try Rayman 2. It plays much like an expansion pack, with a lot of the same, plus a few new ideas thrown in. In fact, I have a bite-sized episode on Rayman 1 for the Game Boy Color that you should probably watch before continuing this video. Like the first game, Rayman 2's story is essentially a bare-bones retelling of the console version, The Great Escape, with robo-pirates descending upon the Glade of Dreams, led by Admiral Razorbeard. They ruin the land and capture many of its inhabitants, including Rayman, and shatter the heart of the world into 800 yellow lums. Lee the Fairy sends Glowbox to aid Rayman by giving him a silver lum, which restores his powers, allowing him to escape. After making his way through the Fairy Glade, Rayman meets Lee, who sends him to find the 4 masks of Polacus. Once you bring all 4 to Polacus, the great entity uses his awesome power to bring Rayman closer to Razorbeard? And he doesn't even get him that close. Rayman still has to traverse 3 levels to reach the rusty old admiral, and that's assuming this Henchman 800 is Razorbeard. Regardless, Rayman defeats the final boss, whoever it is, and saves the day. I'm not too heartbroken by the complete distillation of the Great Escape story into a couple paragraphs of text. I mean, the prior GBC game did that as well. But that game had this really nice artwork to loosely illustrate what was left out in the adaptation. Rayman 2 attempts the same thing, but the art is so laughably poor that I'm convinced it was rushed.
No.
Even if the artist changed between games, no one would sign off on this unless they had to meet a deadline. Rayman journeys through worlds based on levels in The Great Escape, barring their names and aesthetics. These worlds have 3 levels each. Rayman plays exactly as he did in the previous game, and begins with his full moveset, so he can punch his fists, power them up with a charge, and swing from rings. He can also glide, ledge grab, crouch and crawl, and climb vines. Like the first game, Rayman controls well, making this an easy game to pick up and play. However, the gameplay of Rayman 2 and its console version older brother feel more disparate. The small, tightly wound levels of the Game Boy Color games contrast with The Great Escape's expansive, drawn-out levels. So why don't I go ahead and summarize what you'll see in each world. The Fairy Glade uses basic platforming challenges to show you the ropes and introduce bouncy objects. Nothing too crazy, but a competent set of opening levels. The Marsh of Awakening introduces a new mechanic, climbable surfaces like this rigging. My only criticism being the detection on the edges is wonky, but it only amounts to momentary annoyance that's easy to work around. The second level introduces switches which you have to punch to disable electric gates. Typically hitting a switch is permanent, but some of the later ones are temporary. Luckily you can damage boost through the electric gates if you deem their timing too strict. I'm thinking of a very specific instance here. These are 2 mechanics that feature prominently in The Great Escape. Whale Bay brings back the floating rings from which to swing, probably my favorite mechanic. The second level is kinda cool in that your goal is to move down towards the exit, and that involves making your way around obstacles. I just wish the camera panned a little differently here to better help you see. The Cave of Bad Dreams definitely increases the difficulty of the platforming, but also brings back the Super Heli for level 2, which features thrice like it did in the prior game. Level 3 has some exhilarating slippery surfaces. The Canopy is a world about climbing around on spiderwebs, and not much else, besides electric gates that are disabled by killing these nearby spiders. The Sanctuary of Stone and Fire has some slippery surfaces and plums that you ride across rivers of lava. The third level brings back rising lava from the first game, for its first and only appearance sadly. I really like how this breaks up the pace of the game and wish we could have had a couple more, maybe incorporating some of those bouncy platforms? The first level of the Echoing Caves is confusing. It has this whole area to the left of the start that can be completely skipped, holding only a meager couple of collectibles. The main path has a couple leaps of faith where you must assume there's something below, just off screen to land on. It's probably my least favorite level of the whole game. The second is better. My only complaint is the janky climbing sections, but it's not that bad. The third level has one easily missable portion worth noting because you can't retry unless you die, so I had to let Rayman stand on some spikes multiple times to learn the timing of this awkward flying ring. The Precipice's first level is another downward moving one, this time jam-packed with obstacles and hazards, which makes for an enjoyable romp. The only negative here is the camera. The following level is an upward climb with falling barrels, and the third level has 2 timed switches, disabling electric gates guarding the exit. I was pretty close for my first try, but the respawning enemies were so obnoxious that I fully support damage boosting on through. This world culminates in a boss battle where you need to be on the move when the robo-pirate digs up from the ground. Very basic. The Sanctuary of Rock and Lava starts off with a nifty segment where a moving platform travels beneath this ledge, and you have to hurry to keep up with it so you can get back on at the other end. The moving platforms in the second level aren't nearly as interesting, but the third level is another super heli challenge, making some effective use of downward moving vertical platforming. The final world is the Tomb of the Ancients. Its first level has a lot of traditional platforming, and a number of paths branching off from the main one. The second level has some interesting moving platform gauntlets that make for an engaging challenge. The third is the last super heli level, but it's kinda lame. It mixes in the switches, but it's laughably straightforward and unimaginative. After that, we're treated to another boss! That's exactly the same as the first, even though it's literally supposed to be Razorbeard. Though, I guess I'll take that over the travesty that is the Razorbeard fight from The Great Escape. Here are some of the things you'll find while exploring these levels. Cages return from the first game, but there's only one per stage, typically on the beaten path, and they now release a teensy instead of Electoons. The Tings have been replaced with yellow lums, and once collected, they don't reappear. This means if a yellow lum hinted at further platforming off screen to the side or below, and you die and have to redo the section, the guide will no longer be there and you just have to take a leap of faith to reach off-screen areas. This admittedly didn't matter much for me on this run, but I remember having at least one real issue with this on my first run. Checkpoints are now marked with white lums, hearts have been replaced by red lums, and large red lums grant extra lives. While yellow swirls denote the end of the level, red swirls lead to bonus areas where you have to collect around 10 baby glow boxes to score an extra life. If you collect all 800 yellow lums, after beating the game you gain easy access to all the time attack stages on the world map. Kind of a letdown compared to unlocking the 4 Dark Legacy levels in Rayman 1. So, how do Rayman 2's levels fare, and how do they compare with the first's? Full disclosure, while I've played Rayman 1 on the GBC many times, I only first played Rayman 2 recently, so that may sway my opinions. I feel like this set of levels isn't very cohesive. Instead of starting easy, growing more challenging in the middle, and becoming hardest near the end, Rayman 2's levels all sort of hover around the easy to mid difficulty range, and then 1 or 2 really tough levels pop up out of nowhere, notably not in the last 2 worlds. This misses the progression of the first one, where the challenges in each world would outdo those from the prior world, and you could really get a sense of how far you've progressed and how much better a player you've become. That's not really so with Rayman 2. Levels seem to have a much larger focus on jumping from one platform to the next, and don't exhaust Rayman's moveset at all. The flying rings don't get nearly as much screen time, and that's a shame because I really liked those and how Rayman 1 incorporated them into the challenge. To be fair, the levels are otherwise fine. If you're okay with mainly walking and jumping, and the occasional hover and ledge grab, Rayman 2 is a fine little platforming game, but the first one keeps your attention much better by mixing mechanics together and gradually increasing the difficulty. Lastly, the music is reused from the previous entry, though some tracks were slightly altered. But this actually makes sense because the music in Rayman GBC was taken from The Great Escape, so bringing it back for Rayman 2 was appropriate. Some of the song placements do feel weird, but again, that's subjective. After playing Rayman 1 so many times growing up, it came as a shock that there was a direct sequel on the same console. And like its predecessor, Rayman 2 is a game with solid controls and levels that present a decent challenge, all in a quick little package. It even has a save battery. I just wish the challenge progressed more evenly and reached the fair difficulty of the first. Let me know what you think of the Game Boy Color version of Rayman 2, or give me a recommendation for another bite-sized game. Thanks again for checking this out, and I hope to catch you in the next one.